The Nobel Peace Prize Forum is thrilled to have with us today Dr. Steven Pinker, a Canadian-born U.S. experimental psychologist, cognitive scientist, linguist, and popular science author. Dr. Pinker is a professor at Harvard in the Department of Psychology, and he is known for his advocacy of evolutionary psychology and the computational theory of mind. Today, he will share with us the brilliant insights from his groundbreaking book, Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. Here, he argues that violence in the world has declined, both in the long run and in the short run. And he suggests explanations as to why this has occurred. Speaking about this work, Bill Gates says that it stands out as one of the most important books I've read, not just this year, but ever. The phrase, "the better angels of our nature," stems from the last words of US President Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1861, when he was calling on all Americans to avoid the violence that would be the Civil War. Dr. Pinker uses the phrase as a metaphor for four human motivations: empathy, self-control, the moral sense, and reason. These motivations, he writes, can orient us away from violence and toward cooperation and altruism. We look forward to hearing in greater detail from Dr. Pinker how the better angels of our nature can be harnessed for peace. Many of the conversations earlier today have been about all of the violence that is happening in our world. We are excited to have Dr. Pinker with us to hopefully let us know that violence is not the future and that peace is possible. After his speech, Dr. Pinker will be joined on stage by Tom Cran from Minnesota Public Radio. Tom Cran is the host of All Things Considered for NPR News. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pinker.
Thank you very much. Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to persuade you that it is a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from wars and genocides to the treatment of children and animals. I'm going to walk you through 6 major historical declines of violence, try to explain their immediate causes, that is, particular events of the era, and tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely general historical forces interacting with human nature. The first decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until around 6,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy, without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a question that people have been asking for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. Well, these two gentlemen were arguing from the armchair. Neither of them had any idea what life was like in a state of anarchy. But today we can do better, because there are a number of sources of evidence of rates of violence in non-state societies. And I'll mention just one of them, ethnographic vital statistics. Namely, what is the rate of war deaths in people who have recently lived outside of state control, that is, hunter-gatherer, hunter-horticulturalist, and other tribal societies, who live in the pockets of the world where the wave of civilization and government that began around 6,000 years ago left in a state of anarchy. I have found 27 estimates from the literature. I've plotted them all here, and as you can see, they span quite a range from 0 to more than 1,500 war deaths per 100,000 per year, but they average out to 524. That is per 100,000 per year. That is every year on average in these tribal societies, about 0.5% of the population is killed. Let's compare that figure to similar ones for state societies, and I'll stack the deck against modernity by picking some of the most violent countries in their most violent eras, such as Germany in the 20th century with its 2 world wars, which comes in at a rate of 144. Russia in the 20th century, with 2 world wars and a civil war with a rate of 126. Japan in the 20th century, with a world war that ended in not 1 but 2 nuclear strikes with a rate of 27. United States in the 20th century, which fought 2 world wars and at least half a dozen other foreign wars with a rate of 5.7. The world in the 20th century, if you aim for the biggest plausible estimate, adding together all of the deaths in war, in genocide, and in man-made famines, you get a rate of about 60. And here is the comparable rate for the world in the 21st century so far. You can't see the bar because it is less than 1 pixel high, representing 3/10 of a war death per 100,000 per year. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. What was the immediate cause of the transition from these high rates of warfare to the lower rates in modernity? Well, the most plausible is the rise and expansion of states, leading to the various paxes that history students are taught, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. Basically, when a state exerts control over a territory, it tries to stamp out the endemic tribal raiding and feuding, not because the first kings and emperors had a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but rather because raiding and feuding are a nuisance to the overlords, who would just as soon keep the people alive to supply them with taxes and soldiers and slaves. So just as a farmer has a selfish interest in preventing his cattle from killing each other, he doesn't care what they're fighting over, and it's a dead loss to him, so the first kings and emperors tried to stamp out endemic tribal warfare in their territories. The second historical decline of violence can be appreciated by examining this woodcut showing a typical day in the life in the Middle Ages. And the process that brought this mayhem under control has been called the civilizing process. It turns out that homicide data go back in many parts of Europe for 800 years, and historical criminologists have plotted them over time. Here they are plotted on a logarithmic scale from a 1/10 of a homicide per 100,000 per year to 1 to 10 to 100. And as you can see, there's been a massive decline in the rate of homicide in every European country for which data are available, so that a contemporary European has about 1/50th the chance of being killed as his medieval ancestor. Here I've plotted the average of those 5 regions, and for the sake of comparison, the 524 per 100,000 per year average for non-state societies. So this gap I have called the pacification process, this further decline, the civilizing process. I stole the name from a classic book by the German sociologist Norbert Elias, who argued that in the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the feudal patchwork of baronies and principalities and duchies. With it, criminal justice was nationalized, and the former feuding and brigandage and warlording of medieval knights gave way to the king's justice. Also during this era, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce, of money and contracts that could, and other financial instruments that could be recognized within the borders of the newly consolidated states, and a physical infrastructure of commerce, such as better roads and carts and instruments of timekeeping. As a result, zero-sum plunder began to give way to positive-sum trade. And that's a theme I will return to at the end of the lecture. The third decline of violence can be appreciated by recalling some of the ways in which the medieval kingdoms kept law and order within their borders, namely sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half, and impalement. But in a development that's been called the humanitarian revolution, country after country abolished the use of torture as a form of criminal punishment in a remarkably concentrated slice of history centered in the second half of the 18th century. And this included the United States' prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the 8th Amendment to our Constitution, which took place right in the middle of this process. Also abolished during the humanitarian revolution was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the law books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. The death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in almost every Western democracy, with the exception of the United States. Now, the main wave of abolitions of capital punishment took place in the 20th century, as you can see from this graph showing the number of European countries with capital punishment. But this blue curve, which shows the number of European countries that actually carry out executions, shows that well before European politicians had gotten around to striking capital punishment from the law books, their countrymen had pretty much lost their taste for putting people to death. And on average, 50 years elapsed between the time capital punishment was abolished in a European country and the last time someone was actually executed. Now, I mentioned that the United States is an exception to this rule, but even in the United States, capital punishment is dying out as an institution. This graph shows the rate of American executions per capita from 1625 to the 21st century. And as you can see, Americans execute people at a fraction of the rate that they used to. Nowadays, about 40 people are put to death every year in a country that has more than 14,000 homicides in a year. And indeed, of the 50 states, there are only 23 of them that actually practice capital punishment, and that number has been going down year by year. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution, like burning heretics, dueling among men of honor, blood sports, like bear baiting and dog fighting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Now, slavery used to be perfectly legal everywhere on Earth. No one seemed to think there was anything particularly wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery, and so-called democratic Athens was a slave-holding society. But starting in the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions that grew into a flood that eventually swept over the entire Earth. And in 1980, Mauritania became the last country on Earth to abolish legal slavery. What was the immediate cause of the Humanitarian Revolution? Well, there was another name for this era. It's also called the Enlightenment. It is the era in which the rise of dissemination of written material, the growth of literacy, the scientific revolution, led to knowledge replacing superstition and ignorance. And a literate and educated populace is less likely to believe in toxic convictions such as that Jews poison the wells, heretics go to hell, crop failures are caused by witches, children are possessed by the devil, which has to be beaten out of them, Africans are brutish and fit only for slavery, and so on, and that's bound to undermine many rationales for institutionalized violence. As Voltaire said during this era, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. The fourth decline of violence has been called the Long Peace, and it speaks to the frequently made assertion that the 20th century was the most violent in history, a claim that is never backed up by facts from any century but the 20th. And so it's a data point based on a trend based on one data point. Now, it is certainly true that World War II was the worst single thing that ever happened in human history. It's not so clear that it was the most destructive event in terms of the proportion of the world's population at the time that was affected. I'm going to show you a graph from a book called Atrocitology by the amateur historian Matthew White, who combed through his history books and tried to put an estimate on the death toll from the 100 worst things that people have ever done to one another. And I've scaled them by the population of the world at the time. It goes from 500 BC to 2000. And as you can see, history's worst atrocities were pretty evenly sprinkled over 2,500 years of human history. World War II only comes in at 9th place. World War I doesn't even make the top 10. Now you can see that there's a kind of funneling down of the data cloud as you get closer to the present. Presumably this does not mean that in ancient times they only committed really big atrocities, and more recently we've also been committing medium and small size atrocities, but rather it's a reflection of the historical record. The farther back you go in time, the sketchier the data are, and the more likely it would be that a massacre would have gone unrecorded. But we can zoom in on more recent periods, such as the 20th century. And here you can see that there were two unmistakable spikes of bloodletting. But contrary to predictions that this would just be a harbinger of even worse to come, after World War II, you've got a kind of wrinkled carpet hugging the floor. This is the era that has been called the Long Peace, the fact that the world since 1946 has seen a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war, that is, wars between two countries. In fact, the most interesting statistic from this period is 0. This refers to the number of wars fought between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union went out of existence. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. That's almost 70 years, contrary to every expert prediction when I grew up that a global thermonuclear war was inevitable. There have been no wars between any two great powers. These are the 800-pound gorillas that can project military force beyond their own borders since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between any two Western European countries, something that we almost take for granted as an obvious, boring, banal fact. You might be tempted to say, well, of course, no one would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war. But needless to say, this is a historically unusual state of affairs. Prior to 1946, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1945, that went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. The 40 or so countries with the highest GDP have not met each other on the battlefield. Again, that might almost seem obvious that wars are things that are fought in those poor, backward parts of the world. But in fact, for most of human history, it was the big, rich countries that were constantly at each other's throats. And because big, rich countries can afford big, destructive armies, those are the wars that did the most damage. Well, what about the rest of the world? Well, in a development that I call the New Peace, the Long Peace is beginning to spread to the rest of the world. As I mentioned, since 1946, there have been far fewer interstate wars, although there have been more civil wars, as newly independent states with inept governments defended themselves against insurgent movements, with both sides armed, financed, and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. But civil wars in general kill far fewer people than interstate wars, and more importantly, with the end of the Cold War, the number of civil wars declined as well. I'm going to show you now a stacked layer graph. Whoops, this is supposed to display layer by layer, but it isn't. I'll just have to walk you through it then. In a stacked layer graph, the thickness of each layer corresponds to the death rate from a particular category of war, and the height of the entire stack represents the death toll from all wars put together. So let me walk you through it. The red layer here shows the death toll for colonial wars from 1946 to 1975, and of course that tapered off to 0 as European countries divested themselves of their overseas empires. The blue wedges show the rate of death from interstate wars, and here we've got a spike for the Korean War, the era of the Vietnam War, and the era of the Iran-Iraq War. The green wedge shows the death toll from purely internal civil wars, the orange wedge for death tolls from civil wars in which some third power butts in, usually to defend itself against the government. And as you can see, the world has experienced something of a roller coaster, but with an unmistakable downward trend. Now, the gray wedge here shows the data since my book was published in 2011, because a frequently asked question is, have the various wars in the wake of the Arab Spring nullified the decline of war that I wrote about in the book? And as you can see, there has been a small uptick in war as of 2013, the most recent year for which data are available, but it has come nowhere near wiping out the massive decline that the world has seen since the end of World War II. It's wiped out, I would say, about a dozen years of progress, but we're still much better off than we were even in the 1990s, to say nothing of the 1980s, the 1960s, or the late 1940s. The graph for genocide also shows a precipitous decline. The worst year for genocide was, of course, the mid-1940s, when the Nazi, Soviet, and Japanese genocides were in full force. Since then, it has been a painful and awful, but nonetheless unmistakable downward decline. Here we have spikes for the Pakistan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, and the Rwanda genocide. But since then, although genocides have not been wiped out, tragically, they are a fraction of the level that they were just a few decades ago. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, in a famous essay in 1795, Immanuel Kant proposed three hypotheses as to what would generate perpetual peace: democracy, trade, and an international community. And more recently, the political scientists Bruce Russett and John O'Neill have shown that all three of these factors have increased over the second half of the 20th century, and all of them are statistical predictors of peace, holding other factors constant. Finally, we have the rights revolutions, the targeting of violence on smaller scale directed against racial minorities, such as African Americans, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The first of these, the Civil Rights Revolution, put an end to the practice of lynching, which in the United States claimed at the end of the 19th century, 150 African Americans a year were lynched. That's 3 a week. By the 1950s, that had declined to 0. The number of hate crime murders of blacks was never very high in recent times, but even that has declined from 5 a year when the FBI first started keeping statistics to 1 a year. And the kind of racist attitudes that led to violence against African Americans has been in steady decline. Here we have the result of a number of Gallup polls that asked white Americans the questions: do you think that black and white students should go to separate schools? And if a black family moved in next door, would you move out? The numbers have been in steady decline since the 1940s, and now are in the single digits, the rate of crank opinion, and are not even asked anymore in public opinion polls. This seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, not just an American one. This graph shows the number of countries that have apartheid or Jim Crow policies that discriminate against ethnic minorities. This graph shows the number of countries that have affirmative action or remedial discrimination policies that bend over backwards in the other direction to give a leg up to disadvantaged minorities. And we are living in an era in which more countries favor their disadvantaged minorities than discriminate against them. The women's rights revolution has seen an 80% reduction in the rate of rape since data were first kept by the FBI in the early 1970s. There's been a similar decline in the rate of domestic violence, most dramatically for female victims, and a sharp decline in the most extreme form of domestic violence of all, uxoricide, the murder of female romantic partners, and mariticide, the murder of male domestic partners. And as you can see, the decline has been even more dramatic for male victims than for female victims, showing that the women's movement has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights revolution has seen a decline in the institutionalized use of corporal punishment in schools, that is, strapping or paddling, where a majority of states now prohibit it. Polls show that approval of spanking has been in decline in every Western country. And rates of child abuse, both physical and sexual, have declined. The gay rights revolution has seen a steady increase in the number of states worldwide that have decriminalized homosexuality, and in the number of American states that have decriminalized homosexuality, which now stands at 100% thanks to a Supreme Court ruling in 2004. And all public opinion polls in the West show that anti-gay attitudes have been in steady decline. Finally, the animal rights revolution has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, both in the UK and the US, and a sharp decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, This raises the question, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Could it be that human nature itself has changed and that people have somehow lost their inclinations toward violence? Well, I consider this rather unlikely. For one thing, many of declines in violence are far too rapid and too recent to have been products of Darwinian natural selection, which operates over generations. The change of Germany in 1945 from perhaps the most militaristic country in history to the most pacifist country in history in just a generation. Declines of lynching, rape, and spousal abuse, which unfolded over a span of decades. And the 1990s homicide decline in the United States and other Western countries halved the rate of homicide in a decade. Since environmental changes had to have been sufficient to cause these declines, the simplest explanation is that they are responsible for all of the declines. Also, it's not as if we have lost our taste for violence. We still see violence in our children. Rough and tumble play and play fighting are one of the most robust sex differences in human children. Little boys like to fight. And in fact, the most violent age of life is not, as many people think, the late teens and early 20s, but rather it's the twos, in which a large percentage of children hit, kick, or bite. We don't classify it as violence because they can't do much damage, but if 2-year-olds had guns, we might think of things differently. Also, human beings take enormous pleasure in vicarious violence, in experiencing simulations of violence, such as in murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, ice hockey. Sorry, Minnesota, but I'm Canadian, so I can say it. And movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And then there are homicidal fantasies. A number of social psychologists have posed the following question to their subjects. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? And the results are that about 15% of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And about 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people. What does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that 25% of men are liars. A more likely possibility is that human nature is complex and always has comprised both inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations. Well, what are the motives for violence? I don't think violence is a single motive. You've got just raw, pure exploitation, the elimination of a human that just happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want, resulting in rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of threats and rivals. There's a very different kind of violence that is due to dominance, to individuals trying to climb the pecking order and become alpha male. And there is a group equivalent to cockfights, namely the struggles for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. There's moralistic violence or revenge, the conviction that not only is it permissible, but it is mandatory to punish those who you conceive of as having committed a moral infraction, the results being vendetta, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there are utopian ideologies, militant religions, nationalism, fascism, Nazism, communism, which can license vast amounts of violence by their holding out the prospect of a utopia, a world that will be infinitely good forever. Because in a utopian ideology, if the end, the kingdom of heaven on earth that you try to realize is infinitely good forever, you can kill as many people as you want, and you're always ahead of the game. Not only that, but imagine there are people who have heard of your vision for an infinitely good world, and somehow they just don't buy it. They don't get with the program. They stand in the way. Well, how evil are they? You do the math. Hence the old communist revolutionary slogan, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, forgetting the detail that human beings are not eggs. Well, this all sounds pretty depressing. What do we have on the opposite side to counteract these motives for violence? What are the better angels of our nature? Well, there's self-control, circuitry in the frontal lobes of the brain that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit our violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's a moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that regulate what a decent person just doesn't do. And there's reason, cognitive processes that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis. So the question now is, which historical developments bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can commit acts of bloodshed? That is, how do we bring the psychology back together with the history? Well, one possibility is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a Leviathan, a state and judicial system with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. A Leviathan can reduce rates of violence by neutralizing the incentive for exploitative attack, by penalizing aggression and therefore canceling out any anticipated gain. That can calm everyone down because it reduces the need for preemption, deterrence, and vengeance. That is, if the government is deterring your enemies, then you don't have to be big and tough and mean and strong enough to do it. You don't have to, you are not tempted to wipe them out in a preemptive strike before they wipe you out in a preemptive strike. And nor are you obligated to commit revenge after the fact, because you can outsource your revenge to the government. The advantage of doing this is that it circumvents the self-serving biases that social psychologists have shown that humans are prone to. In any human conflict, both sides always believe that their opponent's attacks are unprovoked aggression out of the blue, and their own attacks are justified retaliation after the fact. Well, if you have two sides in conflict that are both deluded by their self-serving biases, you've got the ingredients for endless blood feuds, vendettas, and revenge. Some historical evidence that Hobbes got it right is the pacifying and civilizing effect of states that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and the fact that we can watch this movie in reverse. And when government retreats from effective control of an area, they can break right out into violence all over again, such as the American Wild West, where the cliche of the cowboy movies was that the nearest sheriff is 90 miles away, so you have to defend yourself with your six-shooter. Failed states, collapsed empires, and contraband economies like mafias and street gangs, which can't avail themselves of the dispute resolution apparatus of the state because what they're doing is illegal in the first place, and so defending themselves with the threat of violence is their only recourse against exploitation. Another pacifying force has been called gentle commerce, du commerce. The idea is that plunder is a zero-sum game. The victor's loss is the victor's gain is the victim's loss. But trade is a positive-sum game, one in which everybody wins. And as improving technology allows the trade of goods and ideas over longer distances, among larger groups of people, and at lower cost, it becomes cheaper to buy things than to steal them, and other people become more valuable alive than dead. A third idea is the expanding circle. The term was coined by Peter Singer, but the idea goes back to Charles Darwin, namely that humans are equipped with a sense of empathy, but by default we apply it only to a narrow circle of friends, family, and cute little fuzzy baby animals. But over the course of history, the circle of empathy has expanded from the village to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, to other races, to both sexes, to children, and perhaps eventually to other species. This raises the question of what expanded the circle, and it's likely that increased forces of cosmopolitanism have helped to push it outward. As people engage in more travel, consume more history, more literature and drama, more journalism, they are forced to take the viewpoint of other people, and it becomes harder to dehumanize and demonize them. There's even some experimental evidence showing that when people adopt a real or fictitious person's perspective by reading a first-person account or a story, they become more sympathetic not just towards that individual, but the entire category of people that the individual represents. Finally, there's the escalator of reason, the possibility that the growth of literacy, education, and public discourse have encouraged people to think more abstractly and more universally. They rise above their parochial vantage point. This makes it harder to privilege your own interests over others just because I'm me and you're not. It encourages people to stand back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence and increasingly see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. The final question is, why do so many forces push in the same direction? It does seem like an uncanny conspiracy. I think what these forces have in common is that violence is what game theorists call a social dilemma. Namely, it's always tempting for an aggressor to exploit a victim, but of course it is ruinous to the victim. Since in the long run, aggressors become victims and vice versa, it really is more rational if all parties could agree to avoid the use of violence, if they could just sit down together as reasonable people. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do? Because if you beat your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his swords as swords, you could be in big trouble. One can well see that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we have gradually started to solve other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. And the common denominator between the four pacifying forces is that all of them increase the material, emotional, and cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. Well, whatever the exact causes of the decline of violence turn out to be, I think they have profound implications, and I'll just mention two. One of them is a reorientation of our efforts towards violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset. That is, instead of lamenting why is there war, perhaps a better question would be, why is there ever peace? Not just what are we doing wrong, but what have we been doing right? Because I hope to have convinced you that we have been doing something right, and it seems to me to be extremely important to try to figure out what exactly it is. Finally, the decline of violence forces us into a reassessment of modernity, of the centuries-long process that has eroded family, tribe, tradition, and religion, which have given way to the notions of individual rights, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science. Now, everyone acknowledges that modernity has brought us many gifts: longer and healthier lives, less ignorance and superstition, richer experiences. But there have always been a current of nostalgia and romanticism that has questioned the price. Is it worth it if we have to live in the shadow of terrorism, genocide, world wars, and nuclear weapons? On the other hand, if despite impressions, the long-term trend, though halting and incomplete, is that violence of all kinds is decreasing, I think this rehabilitates the ideals of modernity and progress. And most importantly, it's a cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.